So now that we added this title as a reusable component and we added our reusable colors, it's time to work on the other features that should be implemented into this game screen. And for this, we need to output a guess made by the phone, by the device, because we're playing against the device. And the device should guess, the phone should guess our chosen number. Now, to generate this guess, we need to calculate a random number. And for this, attached you find this utility function, which generates a random number between a min and a max number defined as inputs here. And we can also pass in an exclude number, which allows us to exclude a certain number from being generated, which will be important for making sure that we can't immediately guess the number chosen by the user. Because here I want to make sure that the phone is not able to guess the correct number right at the start. And therefore I add this exclude parameter, which allows me to exclude that single number so that the phone can't win automatically in the first round. It's a little extra difficulty that's added here for the phone. Hence these three parameter values. And then inside of this function here, I generate a random number with this calculation where I use mathRandom, which creates a random number between 0 and 1 with 1 excluded. And I then multiply this with the difference between max and min to translate this random number between 0 and 1 to a random number between our max and min. And I use mathFloor to then round this down, since this would give us a decimal number with decimal places, and we don't want that. We want integers, and we round down with mathFloor. And since we're rounding down, we actually add our minimum boundary again, so that the lowest number we can get is not 0, which would be the lowest number otherwise, because mathRandom can produce 0 as a result, but that instead our lowest possible boundary is the minimum defined here. That's what we do here. And then here I just check if that random number happens to be that number that we excluded, in which case we call generate random between again recursively to simply calculate a new random number. And we keep on doing this until we derived a random number that's not equal to the excluded number. And if we did not hit the excluded number, we just return the random number. So this generates random numbers, and now we want to generate a random number when that game screen is loaded. The first guess made by the device should be generated whenever this game screen is rendered for the first time. And this generated random number will change over time and will be reflected in the user interface because I want to output it here, and therefore we should use state, because we got some data that changes over time and where every change should then be reflected on the user interface. Therefore, in order to manage state here, we import useState from React, of course, as we always do. And in the game screen, we can then initialize our state slice. And here I then have the current guess of the phone and a state updating function. And the initial value for this state should be an initial guess, which we make by simply calling generate random between. And I want to generate a random number between 1 and 100, because the upper boundary will be excluded, because with mathRandom, the upper boundary, which would be 1, is excluded. So we have to go one value, one number above our actual highest number here as well. And then I also want to exclude a number, and that excluded number should be the number chosen by the user on this starting screen. So therefore, we need to make sure that we have access to this chosen number in this component. And how do we get access to values that are derived in different components? Typically through props. We could also use React context, but here I'll just use props. And I'll use object destructuring here right away. Alternatively, we could of course also accept the props object and use the dot notation here, but I will use object destructuring instead. And I expect to get the user number as an input here, as a property on my props object. and I then can exclude this here, so that the phone can't guess this user number when that state is initialized. And then this initial guess is set as an initial value for this state. Okay, so now we have that. Now we have this guess that's being made, and now we can output this guess here in our user interface. And for outputting this guess, I want to build a nice looking text here, a nice looking text element, which I actually will outsource into a separate component. Not because we have to, but because I want to keep this component a bit leaner, and especially the JSX code a bit leaner. Therefore, in the components folder, I will add a game folder to add the game-related components into that folder. And I'll move primary button and title into a UI folder to store general UI-related elements in that folder. This is not required, but helps me organize my files. So I'll move these files, and I do want to update my imports automatically, so I will choose always automatically update imports to make sure that all the imports are updated such that moving these files doesn't break the app. And in that components game folder, we can now add a number container, the name is up to you, which will be a simple container that is responsible for outputting the number that was guessed. For this here, I'll add a function, number container, so a default component function here, which is exported. And I want to return a view that contains a text. I add this extra view as a wrapper so that I can nicely position and style this text. Of course, as you learned, we need to import these two core components from React Native, otherwise we can't use them. So that's something we have to do. And then I expect to get the number that should be output as a prop here, and I expect to get it as the prop that is used, or as the value that is used between the opening and closing tags of this custom component when that component is used in a different file. So hence we can use this special children prop to output that content. Now this container is mostly about the styling, of course, and therefore I will add my styles here by using style sheet create, as we did it many times before. And now the styles that I do want to have here are one style for the container, so for the view, and then one style set or one set of properties for the text, for the actual number text, you could say. These names, as always, are up to you. Now for the container, it's totally up to you, and as always, I encourage you to play around with that and come up with any styles you want. I will set a border width, which we already did many times at this point. I will give this a border color, and here I want to use my global colors so that I take advantage of this global definition of colors. So I will go up to constants and then to the colors file with this import. And then I want to use color accent 500, so this yellow color here as a color. I'll add a lot of padding with 24 pixels, and I'll add a border radius of 8 maybe to have rounded corners. That's why we also need a view, because border radius is not supported on the text element. So if I would have used just a text without a wrapping view, I could have added things like the border and padding, but adding a border radius would not have been possible on iOS. Hence, we need the extra view as a wrapper. Now I also want to have some margin around this box, so actually here I'll also add a margin of 24 pixels. And since all these views are flex boxes by default, I will add align items center and justify content center to make sure that the actual text in that container is nicely centered. And then on the number text, which is the style that will be applied to this text component here, I will set the color to colors accent 500, so to the same yellow, and the font size to 36, so that we have a really big number. And I'll set the font weight to bold here. And now we can apply these styles to these elements here. So the container style is applied to the view, and the number text style is applied to the text. And that's now the number container component that should be used in the game screen to output the guessed number. So for this here, below this title, I'll output the number container, which therefore, of course, must be imported from components game number container. And with that import added, we can use that here in our JSX code. And between the opening and closing tags, I will pass in the current guess that was made by the phone. Now, if we save that and reload everything, it looks like there is an error with this import. Looks like this import path was not updated by VS Code. The title component is now in the UI subfolder, so we must look for it there. And in addition, looks like a couple of other imports also were not adjusted. Like here inside the title component, we need to go up one step further. We need to go up to a higher level folder because we moved title into a lower level folder, into this new UI folder. So that was also missing. And now it looks like things are working again. So let's force a reload on all these devices. And now if I start this game, here is my guess. And actually, if I look at this, I think it will look a bit nicer if the title is not also yellow, but if it is maybe white. So here in title.js, instead of using colors accent 500, I'll use white. By the way, we could store this white color in our colors constant as well, but since this is already a clear predefined identifier, I'll just use it like this. Yeah, this looks a bit nicer. Now we have our guess here, and this initial guess, of course, will be different every time we start a new game. So here on Android, it's different than what we see on iOS, for example. And if we would restart the game on iOS, we would also very likely get a different number the next time. But of course, that's just the first step. Deriving an initial random number is nice, but now we need to make sure that we have buttons that allow us to give the computer some feedback on whether that number is too big or too small so that a new number can be derived.